avidly. So I grew up under a Thatcher government on a council estate near Orgreave in Sheffield, the daughter of a Somali steelworker and granddaughter of a Liverpool docker, a heritage that was always going to determine my socialist politics. Growing up at a point in time when neoliberalism was taking shape, the Tories were selling off all of our assets, our means of production, and I started my working life during a period of hostile anti-trade union laws. My home city, Sheffield, is now ranked as the low-pay capital of the UK. Zero-hour contracts arrived, the steel and mining industries all but disappeared. I've lived the life of Tory decline. So as an NEC candidate, I will fight to ensure as a party we remain committed to developing the radical social agenda that we've gained over the last 5 years. Because if we are to address the real needs of people, we have to radically develop our last two manifestos. Socialism drips off every page of those manifestos, which is why we must not throw them away under some pretense that they were unpopular. The circumstances that led to those policies haven't changed. In fact, the pandemic makes them even more important. And I thought I'd just go through a few. So the Green Industrial Revolution crisis has not gone away. The climate emergency is more critical than ever. And as we know, if December hadn't been the Brexit election, our party would have won on our green industrial revolution policies alone. We also know that the next generation of voters will have this at the heart of their vision for the future. This must be the basis of our policies moving forward. Taking on big polluters will mean we can't become beholden to big business or donors. On our public ownership commitments, I grew up at a time, as I said, when those assets belonged to us. And I recently spoke with Chris Saltmarsh, who's part of Labour for a Green New Deal. And he's clear now, I totally agree with him. Taking services back into public ownership was not just a nice thing to do because we had a socialist leader. These policies are essential for a Green New Deal. We need to run the economy for people and planet, not profit, and private companies won't do this. We also need to expand our public ownership. We need more sectors like manufacturing and food, to name a few, and how crucial some of those were at the start of the pandemic, with food shortages and contracts going to random companies to build respirators, just proves this. Our broadband policy, look how relevant that became within 3 months of us being ridiculed. You know, it was needed for remote home learning for schools and universities. School widening has seen more schools having to send children home due to outbreaks, and we've now got university students locked in their accommodation due to COVID spikes that were predicted, and now we're asking for them to be allowed home for Christmas. What an absolute mess. Profit at the core of every decision made by this government. Eradicating food banks. Well, my local food bank has gone from supporting 25 families a week to over 100, and that was before the pandemic. During the pandemic, thousands have been left without money for weeks due to universal credit claims because of job losses or falling through the gaps. And some of these families have never accessed our welfare system before. Across the country, there are thousands of people that now know the reality of a welfare system that works against our class with its pernicious punishments. And our beloved NHS, look how essential the NHS has been during this crisis, but also how glaringly obvious that underfunding and under-resourcing has been over the last 10 years. Lack of PPE equipment was a scandal, and look at the mess this government has made of track and trace, just so they can give deals worth millions to their mates. Further backdoor privatisation of the NHS, which has resulted in people being unable to get access to tests for themselves or their children and families. Council house building, well, this has always been needed for as long as I can remember, but look at how private tenants have been treated during this pandemic, threatened with eviction, with the government complicit by withdrawing the eviction ban, despite calls for this to be extended during one of the biggest crises we've faced as a country. 3 million WASPy women still robbed of their pensions. My eldest sister, one of them, has to continue working until March next year before she's even able to think about retiring, years beyond when she should have been able to. Our commitment to those women is still relevant. So for me, after 10 years of austerity and falling living standards, the coronavirus has highlighted the weaknesses in our economy and our public services. The current market economy is based on short-term planning and inequality. We must defend living standards and public services. To get the economy moving again, we must demand public ownership of key utilities and investment in public services, housing, education, to create well-paid unionised jobs. Change is needed in our economy following the pandemic. But at the heart of any economic measures must be a serious commitment to tackle the climate emergency. We need a socialist Green New Deal to invest in renewable energy, green infrastructure, and to provide a just transition by the 2030s, taking on the big polluters and calling for international climate justice. So as a party and as a country, we can't go back to business as usual. It's our job to get this message out, explaining why our socialist policies are so important now more than ever after the global pandemic. We can't have socialism for the rich and austerity for the poor, where the corporations are giving handouts while workers suffer declining pay and conditions and millions lose their jobs. When we put people first, as our last two manifestos did, that benefits everyone in our society, and it's why I'll fight for them for as long as I can. Thank you.
Thank you, Nadia. And I just wanted to sort of say it was really good to actually kind of run through some of the bits in the manifesto that are actually really useful and pertinent. My favourite bit in the manifesto was the broadband. And I think the last few months have proved exactly why we all need it as we struggle to get online and activate things. But thank you very much for that. Just to say for people who are just starting to tune in, if you haven't already been on Labour Hub, that's labourhub.org.uk. We obviously have lots of these debates and discussions all the time about what kind of policies we should be fighting for and how we should be going about it. So please do look at the website and please read some of the different thoughts that people have posted there. We're going to move on to Andrew Fisher, who was, I think, instrumental in both of those manifestos, although he might tell me something different. But he was former senior policy advisor to the Labour Party and Jeremy Corbyn, and he also co-founded the Left Economic Advisory Panel, which you know he was very which produced some really interesting stuff actually way before Jeremy Corbyn got elected to leader of the Labour Party. So I'm going to hand over to Andrew. Thank you.
Well, thanks, Jenny, for that introduction, and thanks to the Labour Hub for organising and for inviting me to speak. The manifesto was a huge team effort. I guess I was instrumental, but I was just one instrument within that orchestra, I guess is what I'm saying. So I think we have to look at how we, retain, how we popularise, how we develop our policy from where we are. But I think we need to look at where we start from today, because it's a slightly odd sort of period. As Nadia said, Keir Starmer was elected with 10 pledges, which were remarkably similar to those 10 pledges that Jeremy stood on in 2015. In his election campaign, his leadership election campaign, Keir Starmer also called the 2017 manifesto my foundational documents. That should be encouraging to us. And I think we have to hold him accountable on that and ensure that when the leadership does row back on some of these areas, that they feel it, that they hear from us on that. It's our job as members. It's not a spectator sport. We're not there just to cheer. We're there to interact and to campaign. But I'm not for preserving in aspect the last two manifestos either. And before I kind of start dismantling it, which I won't entirely, you'll be unsurprised to hear, I just want to go through a couple of the bits in the last manifesto. So raising the minimum wage to 10% was supported by 73% of the public. This was polling done by Delta Poll, which I'll tweet after the meeting, actually, just to get it all out there. Tax rises on those earning more than £80,000. So that's people who are inside the top 5% of earners. That was supported by 66% of voters, including a majority of Tory voters, is interesting to note. Building more council homes, again, supported by a majority of voters, 66%, 2/3 of voters, and a majority of Tory voters. Even providing free broadband, which was controversial at the time, was supported by 47% of voters, but opposed by 41%. So it still had a majority in favour of it. But again, something we probably needed to do a little bit more groundwork for if I'm going to be reflective, and I think we all should be. But circumstances have changed. We're in the COVID crisis, and we do have to go further in some areas, and in some areas, some things are less important now. And we have to, I think, ensure we're winning the argument in the country, and that means engaging with where people are at and what the current relevant issues are. Because in a way, the focus for now is not Labour Party policy making. there was no policy-making conference this year. There will be one, hopefully, in September 2021. There's no election for 4 years. But government is having to make very, very quick policy decisions now, and it's coming under pressure on some of those things. The eviction ban was extended, for example, because tenants' unions and others campaigned around it, not because the Tories wanted to do it. So there are a number of things like that where I think there are pressure points. I just want to run through a few of those. So firstly, the national minimum wage. Now, there's a debate raging at the moment about whether the increase in the national minimum wage should go ahead. This is, people earning the absolute minimum legally. Business groups are campaigning to say it shouldn't. Even the Resolution Foundation, the sort of centrist think tank, said it shouldn't go ahead, or it should go ahead in a sort of smaller way, so 15p rise instead of a 55p rise or something like that. I think we have to get out there saying, yes, it should. And we have to look for hooks for that. So, for example, when Labour said in one of its few policy announcements that it's done, that actually all care workers should be on the real living wage. Well, actually, why shouldn't delivery workers? Why shouldn't shop workers? Why shouldn't the cleaners in our hospitals? They deserve a pay rise too. And I want to hear Labour campaigning for the minimum wage rise to go ahead, because that's a fairly simple thing, and I think we can win on it, and the trade unions need to get out there on it as well. On universal credit, they increased the basic payment by £20 because they realised a lot of middle class people who probably hadn't been on social security would suddenly go on it and realise how crap it was, frankly. That's why I think they did it, because they realised it wasn't enough. But that temporary increase didn't extend to disabled people on employment and support allowance, for example, and people on legacy benefits that hadn't been transferred onto universal credit. So we have to campaign for it to be extended and maintained, that increase, and indeed go further, I would argue. I think ending no recourse to public funds. We all know about the tragic case of Mercy Baguma. We don't yet know the full details of that case, of whether that particular policy applied to her, but there's been several other cases where people have been denied access to benefits, access to housing, access to even work through our hostile environment. So dismantling that is an urgent priority as well. I think as well, and it goes back to the first point I made about the Tories being forced into policy, we saw at the start of the crisis, they had a policy called Everybody In, where they paid for rooms in hostels and hotels and virtually got every single homeless person off the streets. They did it in spring. I think we need to be saying, as we approach winter and with the second wave coming, they've got to do that again. So again, there are campaigning hooks that we can use to push ahead on policy. And if Labour come with us, great, but let's build the pressure so that it makes it inevitable that they have to. Again, on social care, at the moment, the second wave doesn't seem to have broken into social care homes, at least on the same scale that it did in the first wave. But of course, care workers are parents. They have children in school who are coming home, who are coming home having been told they have to isolate because there's an outbreak in their class or in their bubble. So again, this will happen. And I think we need to be talking about the money and resources and the PPE going into social care as well as campaigning for the real living wage, as I mentioned. The privatisation and the outsourcing, again, we have seen huge and quite frankly larcenous payments going to the friends of Tory MPs and to Tory donors. We need to stop this. I think, as Zara Sultana said eloquently in the Commons last week, it's not NHS test and trace, it's Serco test and trace, and that's why it's crap, frankly. So again, we have to find the hooks that are contemporary, that are urgent to campaign on around policy at this time. Now, there's been a lot of kind of mood music and a lot of briefing, but actually if you look at what Labour has said in terms of policy, don't worry, this won't take long, they've said two things, right? One is that care workers should be on the real living wage, and secondly, that we should outlaw the fire and rehire policy that we've seen in British Airways and British Gas and I think a couple of other major employers. Those things are great, but let's campaign on them. Let's not just say them once in a speech and then end it. We need to be campaigning on those points because they're good policies, actually, the two policies that they have announced. And we need to push them to go further on things like the things I've said before. I think one of the other things we've got to do, and this is one of the things that the Claim the Future project that I'm involved with John McDonnell has been doing, is speak to people. And that means not just talking to experts and policy wonks, but activists, trade unionists, even activist lawyers, just to annoy the Tories. And I'm talking about the sort of people who are fighting evictions, fighting deportations on a daily basis. We need to be speaking to those people and organising together inside and outside the Labour Party So I look at what Momentum are doing, working with London Renters Union and Acorn and Living Rent in Scotland to oppose evictions, and what they've just put up on Momentum's website. And I think this is a really good example of good practice within the party, is they put information there on how to campaign alongside those people to stop evictions and oppose evictions from happening, campaigning advice, legal advice, educational materials, draft resolutions for CLPs. That's a really good sort of thing to get involved with. And again, I'll post the link in the chat as well as tweeting it after this meeting. Similarly, Don't Leave Organised, just so I'm pluralistic across the Labour left, are working with the Bakers Union and others on the campaign to increase statutory sick pay, which again is urgent because, of course, Matt Hancock said he can't survive on £95 a week. So why the hell should anyone else be expected to, let alone, of course, people who are on benefits that pay even less, whether that's job seekers allowance or carers allowance. I think the other thing we need to do as well, and this does relate to policy, back Nadia and the other members of the Grassroots Voice slate on the NEC elections, because not only does the NEC obviously have influence in between, it also is on the Clause 5 meetings when we do get around to having another manifesto. They have a vote there, and we need socialists having their say in that. So it's very important we get those people elected. I think also organising in your CLP so that, you know, if you haven't got a Labour MP at the moment, that the next Labour MP is a socialist, the next Labour candidate is a socialist. You know, no fight has ever been won by walking away. And I just want to finish on this point, which is where I kind of confess my aging years. I've been a Labour Party member for 24 years, since 1996, consistently throughout, sometimes hanging on by the edge of my fingers, it has to be said, by a thread. But I'll tell you something, this is the most organised the left has ever been within the party. Yes, we suffered a setback in 2019, but we are still in a far better place than we were, or even than we thought we were, really, I suppose, in 2015. You know, we are much more organised, much bigger, much more in touch with the community campaigns, with the trade unions and others than we have ever been. And I say that as somebody who has been on the Labour left for 24 years. So I think we shouldn't give up. We should not just shrug our shoulders if people tell us, oh, I'm fed up, I'm leaving. This isn't a spectator sport. It isn't a fan club for the leader. This is the Labour Party. It belongs to us as members. It belongs to the trade unions. It belongs to our class, frankly. So stay in, fight, organise, and we will win.
Thank you, Andrew. I kind of want to clap at this point. I had exactly the same conversation with an activist just today about staying on in and fighting. So it's really good to hear that from you, and also to hear some of your thoughts about what Labour could be doing now in terms of policy. I think that's really interesting, because actually, I think the Labour movement as a whole has probably never been more active or asked to do more things than it's been doing right at this moment. Trade unions are recruiting members hand over fist. They are active in workplace. Health and safety reps are suddenly the job you can never get anybody to do, everybody wants to do. So we have a purpose and we have a role, but we need to kind of translate that much more, I think, visibly into what the Labour Party is saying and use that influence to put pressure on the government. So thank you for that. I'm going to next ask Amy Jackson, who is, and she tells me her title is Director of Executive Policy, but nobody ever knows what that means. So she's Political Director for Unite the Union. Over to you, Amy. Thank you.
Hiya, thanks Jenny, and thanks very much to Labour Hub for putting this really good event on and for inviting me along. As Jenny said, I'm essentially the political director at Unite the Union, and before that I was the political secretary to Jeremy Corbyn. So I guess I spent the past few years, like everybody else, campaigning for socialist policies, and very much want to see those policies continued on by not only by the current Labour leadership, but also the grassroots members still fighting for them through all the different structures that Andrew was just laying out. And I'd also like to say I completely agree with what Andrew just said in terms of the Labour left being stronger and more organised than ever. If you look at the difference between where we were in 2015 and where we are now, we've got incredible sort of media operations going on, like Tribune and Novara. The trade unions are incredibly strong and also more, as Jenny was saying, more relevant than ever at the moment. And the grassroots members are really up for it. I remember, everybody else will, in in the election in 2019 as well as 2017, the huge amount of campaigners out in the snow, the rain, the cold, the wind, and they kept going, and those people haven't gone away, and they're looking for something to fight for. So it's so important that we remember all of that, and we don't end up in the wilderness, as quite a lot of people have warned. So obviously, the government is getting more and more disturbing by the day. One of the few things that I've seen over the past couple of days was how they are now banning and calling extreme any speakers that might suggest that capitalism isn't the only economic thought available and way of doing things. And putting Paul Dacre in as chair of or as head of Ofcom, can't remember what the title is, but all of these things are terrifying and makes me think the most important thing for Labour to do is win, and our entire focus has to be on that. I don't agree that you necessarily win by the way of, going after, like, wrapping yourself in the Union Jack. I actually think it's much more about bold economic policies. So in order to win, obviously, we have to maintain the seats that we have in the cities, but we've also got to win back those seats that we've lost in the held back towns and communities that voted against us in swathes in 2019. And it's quite clear from the last few years that there is a massive desire for big economic change. We saw obviously the Brexit referendum result, the 2017 general election result, then the 2019 election result based on Get Brexit Done and the continuing popularity of Scottish independence. This is clearly a country that is crying out for big change. And polling consistently shows across our coalition of voters that the thing that unites them is bold economic policies. And that's obviously what we have to keep fighting for. And I agree as well about the point about Keir's 10 pledges and how he very much sold himself on a left policy platform, and we have to keep on holding him to account on those pledges and not allowing him to row back, because if he's going to get elected as leader on those pledges, people surely have to be able to trust him if he's then going to make certain pledges to be Prime Minister. So in terms of, people have already spoken a lot about the policies from the two manifestos, and essentially they can be summed up pretty quickly. I mean, there's a lot of detail around them, but tax the rich to pay for public services and the NHS, higher minimum wage, no tuition fees, build more homes, nationalise rail, mail and utilities, obviously the brilliant broadband policy, and despite some people arguing that we should scrap these sort of policies and that they're not popular with the public, actually public ownership, the popularity of public ownership in the country has actually grown since 2017 and continues to grow. So there is no argument that we should be scrapping those policies at all. But as the 2019 election showed us, it's also not enough to make great policy offers. We definitely made great policy offers, but what we need to do is link it all together in a common narrative. And I also think it's important that as well as maintaining the brilliant policies that we had under Jeremy's leadership, we have to respond to the present rather than seeming to hark back to the past. The world has very clearly dramatically changed since 2019, and the very new problems that we face require new solutions. And I think there's three major crisis points for the country. And I'm going to focus on policies around these areas that I think we should be fighting for. So the three sort of flashpoints are health, and that's public and individual, jobs or the lack of jobs, mass unemployment in the wider economy, and of course the climate emergency looms over all of this. So in terms of the policies we should be thinking about on the left, and that are very, very important for the current moment, obviously we have to end privatisation and outsourcing in the NHS. Private companies on every single measure in every country that they exist fail to provide the same levels of care as publicly provided health services. They cost billions and ultimately fail when measured against publicly provided ones. And, you know, if you look at Scotland, when the NHS in England is currently really struggling, in Scotland, which has no outsourcing at all, satisfaction with the NHS has actually gone up by 20% since 2005. You know, the outsourcing within the NHS is so it's so clearly failed when it comes to providing an effective test and trace service in this crisis. We need to be campaigning to get rid of Serco and allowing local authorities to work on test and trace, use UK produced tests, of which there are many. There's actually a company in Derbyshire that produce 1 million tests a week. That those results are ready in around 10 minutes and are something like 98% effective. And the UK government has not bought a single test from this company. So they're shipping them out to all countries across the world. They're called SureScreen, if you want to look at it, look it up. But they're shipping their tests out to countries across the world, and yet there hasn't been a single purchase from the UK government from this company. And we also need to be using NHS labs, which are, you know, Unite has members in those NHS labs, and they are not being used anywhere near as much as they could be. And it's really just, I can't remember who said it, if it was Andrew or Nadia, but this entire crisis has exposed the Tories and how much they are lining the pockets of their mates during this crisis. So in terms of individual health, we need to be continuing to campaign to increase the statutory sick pay to the levels of a real living wage. So right now it's £96 a week, and we should be raising that up to £326 a week, because right now the average person, if they're off sick on statutory sick pay, loses 80% of their income. And that puts a huge amount of pressure on people to stay in work when they're not well. And in some of the most, you know, tragic of circumstances, there was an example of that cleaner in the Ministry of Justice, Emmanuel Gomez, who couldn't afford to stay at home. So he kept on going into work cleaning when he had COVID, and he very sadly died. And this is the real life consequence of not having an adequate sick pay that allows people to stay off when they're actually really, really ill, or in fact just a bit ill. But it shows the extremes that people will go to when they're that worried about money, and what a totally tragic consequence from a really awful sort of state provision of sick pay. We also need to much more widely increase the levels of state support, which, you know, Andrew's already talked about, but we are the lowest levels in sort of modern history. The state support for people who are unable to work for whatever reason was much more generous in Thatcher's time. So that says it all, and she stripped a huge amount away. We also need to think about health and safety at work, which, as Jenny was saying, has now become a hot topic, which, and for a long time it wasn't, as well as making sure people are safe at work, especially at the moment. We have to include mental health and well-being within the health and safety regulations. COVID has exposed the mental health crisis. It was already enormous before it hit, and now it's got a lot worse. And it's very important that health and safety legislation takes that into account. we should be considering doing again what Scotland is doing, which is having roving health and safety reps going from workplace to workplace. And these people are trained health and safety reps, trade union members who go and check that workplaces are safe. It happens in Scotland. There's absolutely no reason it shouldn't be happening in the rest of the UK as well. So these are just some examples on how to improve health. And as we know, the public health crisis has unfolded into an economic crisis, and we have mass unemployment very much on the horizon. We've currently got 9 million people furloughed until the scheme ends at the end of October. And we saw Rishi Sunak come out with his job support scheme last week, which is absolutely not enough to prevent millions of people ending up out of work. The government absolutely must do more, and Labour have to keep hitting them hard. This deal is not good enough for workers. So they should have extended furlough like so many other European countries have done, and we frankly should be saying it, but we also need to be demanding other sorts of support, so targeted support for the hardest hit sectors like hospitality, aviation, automotive. We should be campaigning for massive investment in infrastructure, if not now, when? The government absolutely must be doing more to creating jobs, to create jobs, and Labour should be shouting from the rooftops about that. Why are they not spending more on infrastructure projects at the moment? In fact, they're holding back a lot of money from big infrastructure projects that should be going ahead. They could be building more housing, which we desperately need, and using the government's own procurement power to invest back into the economy and create jobs. And these are just some of the things Labour should be talking about, and obviously we should be campaigning for. And these must be decent jobs. The insecure work and low pay has clearly done absolutely nothing for the financial resilience of households across the country, which this crisis has exposed. So, you know, we can't have time. We can't have. The country does not have time to continue on with insecure, low-paid work. And then, lastly, the climate emergency is obviously one of the greatest challenges that we face. And the fact that the richest 1% cause twice the CO2 emissions of the poorest 50% in the world shows you that the tackling inequality, and that's global inequality as well as just in this country. So tackling inequality and climate change are inextricably linked, and we have to see the two as a joint challenge. And, you know, only socialist policies are ever going to address the underlying issues of climate change. So, you know, as well as sort of tackling wealth inequalities, we also need to be thinking about how we and campaigning for tackling structural inequalities that are experienced by women and minority groups. And we have to push for a swift and just transition to the green economy that brings workers with us. We will not get anywhere in terms of moving to a greener economy if we don't make sure that workers and good jobs and high skills are protected. That's absolutely fundamental to bringing the industry and the workers on board. There's so many opportunities to invest in infrastructure. There's so many examples, like building 4,000 electric buses and leasing them out to bus operators across the country, investing in sort of accessible and affordable public transport systems so people can actually afford to get the trains, which, as we all know, are ludicrously expensive, supporting the automotive industry properly to make that transition to hybrid, full battery and hydrogen vehicles, by making sure that the government provides the necessary charging infrastructure across the country, because right now it's woeful, that there's incentives for manufacturers to make these vehicles, and also incentives for consumers to buy them, because a lot of people right now find them far too expensive. We also need decent investment in local authorities, because they are fundamental in improving waste and recycling facilities, and also in assisting with ensuring that communities have access to greener modes of transport, and also encourage to do walking and cycling and all that kind of thing. Also housing, I mentioned it before, but for around a third of the nation's CO2 emissions. So we need to keep campaigning for zero carbon homes and a large-scale programme of retrofitting houses to make sure that we both reduce carbon emissions, but also reduce fuel poverty. And lastly, it's very difficult for us to tackle the climate emergency without making this a truly global effort. And one of the policies that's really important to this, amongst many others, is that we ensure the free transfer of green energy technology to developing countries to reduce the reliance on such sort of heavy carbon emitting technology. So all of I've obviously gone through quite a lot of policies there, but none of these are going to happen without an interventionist socialist government. And Labour should never, ever shy away from being that. And in fact, I don't think we will win without such bold policies that the country is crying out for. Thank you.
Thank you, Amy. That's really, you're getting quite a few claps. That's really covering lots of ground, and I think it's really interesting to kind of sit back and look at kind of quite how huge the job is really, and coronavirus highlighted a lot of that for us. I know whilst you were speaking, there were a couple of people who posted in the question and answers, but just to urge people to actually put their questions in there. We will be coming to panellists at the end to ask some of those questions, so do feel free to do that. And somebody's commented about the bit chat being disabled. Sorry about that, but it is massively distracting when you're speaking to have chats popping up all the time. It's one of the reasons we do it. And I have had a lot of people complain to me that it doesn't make the meetings very accessible either for some people, which is why it's been disabled. I'm actually going to now bring in John McDonnell, who, as many of you will know, was former Shadow Chancellor and is MP for Hayes and Harlington. I've known John for many years. He's never really kind of given up the struggle of arguing for better policies in the Labour Party. And he was lucky enough to help to try and make some of them. So I really want to hear what you've got to say about how we take things forward, John.
Thanks, Jenny. I've known you for many years. We've been on platforms together. You usually get me into trouble as a result, I should think. So I'll be careful. Just listening to Nadia, I don't know Nadia very well, apart from I know what commitment she's shown in terms of campaigning. But every time I listen to you, Nadia, you remind me of why I'm in the Labour Party and what it's all about. You really do, in terms of just going back to that period, and we're in there again, that Thatcher period, when there's high levels of unemployment and total neglect of basic humanity within our community as a result of that government. You know, when Thatcher said there's no such thing as community, she meant it. She definitely meant it. And as a result of that, tried to almost personally deconstruct our communities right the way across the country, particularly attack on working class. Now, people seem to forget the racism during that 80s period that emanated from the Conservative Party. They gave permission for racism virtually within our society to blossom. Andrew's taken people through some of the immediate campaigns that a number of us are working on. He mentioned the Claim the Future venture that a few of us launched a few months ago. The purpose of that was not to set up another organisation. God, we've got enough of those on the left in the Labour Party, but more to try and say, could we informally network as much as possible by taking those who are doing detailed research and policy development, the wonderful architecture of think tanks that we now have as a result of the last 5 years under Jeremy, and how can we link that with the campaigns on the ground and bring campaigners together with detailed policy experts? So it's that development of theory and practice together, the old concept of praxis, that welding of theory and practice, so that when we go out there campaigning, we really know the solutions, we really know what the answers are, and we can communicate them and campaign effectively on that. And for me, it's been quite an experience because we've been sitting down, bringing different groups of people together and setting up panels for discussion. It's all been discussion, it hasn't been speeches. and just listening to people, their own experiences in terms of campaigns and why they're campaigning, what their motives are, and then also linking that up with some of the theoretical analysis on that particular issue, whether it be the global south and debt, or whether it be the role of the finance system, or whether it be housing or treaty rights, employment matters, or green issues. It's just been absolutely fascinating. And it always amazes me, again, just the breadth of knowledge that is there in our movement coming from working class experience. So that's that. And so Andrew ran through a whole, how that debate has evolved really into, here's an issue, here are people campaigning on it, here's some people doing some research and policy development on it, and then what's the key demand that we should all swing behind. And the idea behind it is that people are planting flags in these campaigns on different issues, and our job as socialists in solidarity is to rally to that flag, to give them whatever assistance and support we can. And it's sort of evolved into a whole range of different campaigning issues. And what Amy's done is just given us a comprehensive, absolutely brilliantly comprehensive survey of all the issues that we're confronting as a movement and where we need to go from here. The issue for me now is the 2017-2019 manifestos were terrific, but actually we need to be much more radical now. And here's a sense of irony. Let me give you this one anecdote. Before the general election for Radio 4, the Today programme, they asked me, would I have this debate around economic policy and I think it was taxation in particular, investment, with a billionaire? And I said, yeah, okay. So the BBC went out and found a billionaire called John Caldwell. And I said, well, he's going to have to come to Hayes, my constituency, because I'm busy. So they came down, they set up a mini studio in the Labour Hall in my constituency. And in comes this billionaire. He's literally just arrived from at Heathrow, I think from the Caribbean. It was almost stereotypical. But he was sort of a bluff Yorkshireman, sort of the I made my money this way. I got on all right with him. I had no qualms with him personally, but everything I said in terms of the need for policy and where we need to go, he seemed to agree with, but at the same time wouldn't believe that we were carried out. He was protective of his class interest in terms of wealth, protecting his wealth, etc. Even though he admitted he gave a lot of his wealth away to different charitable causes, etc. But he just wouldn't agree, even though everything I said about what we were going to do, he seemed to acknowledge was needed. He just couldn't lend his support. I said, well, fair enough. I said, I'll see you after the election sometime. I haven't seen him since, but the irony of it all was he was interviewed on he was interviewed on the BBC World at 1 today, and he was saying, he said, I'm not criticising Boris Johnson, but I'm saying to Rishi Sunak, he needs to do the following things: invest in apprentices, invest in the infrastructure, rail, etc., invest in green technologies and alternative fuel sources, and blow me, invest in full fibre broadband. I roared with laughter. In this game, you have to have a laugh sometimes. You have to have a smile sometimes. And literally, effectively, what he did, he was citing Labour's last manifesto. It's quite remarkable, really. But it shows you how things have moved on, partly because of the pandemic, but actually I think they've moved on anyway, no matter what, because there was a reality that neoliberalism was coming to its end, and it was unsustainable anymore, politically, economically, and actually socially and morally as well, because of its consequences over the last decade, in particular of austerity, but also its dominance of economic thinking and political thinking over the last 40 years as well. So I think that it is time to move on. And a lot of the ideas that Andrew and Nadia and Amy have thrown out is exactly, yes, what we have to build upon. And in each area of policy now, what's interesting is force of circumstance is moving us, and I think society as a whole, to be much more radical than before. And I welcome that. And the issue for us is that we mustn't be left behind. In fact, we've got to play a leadership role in this, in making sure that as people demand more radical solutions, we've got to be the ones who help shape those solutions. And we'll talk a minute about how we do that. But I just give that one example that Andrew cited. we had this conversation about housing, and we had people like, the wonderful Liz Davis, the housing lawyer, who's helped us over the years. We had a number of the campaigning organisations, Renters Union, Acorn as well, and housing policy experts there too. And it was interesting. It was focused on, yes, how do we ensure that coming out of the pandemic, people are protected against eviction? How do we ensure that actually their debts are coped with? And how do we also ensure that there's security for the future, and therefore rent controls are introduced as well? But it evolved into something different. All of those were said, they're all naturally obvious policies we need to go for. Ending eviction, banning the evictions, changing the law, getting rid of Section 21 evictions, introduce rent controls, making sure there's proper security of tenure. Yes, eliminate the debt that's been built up by renters over the COVID crisis. But then actually what happened then was, well, why do we have landlordism at all? What use do landlords, particularly corporate landlords, play in our society apart from profiteer from people's basic housing need and escalate housing prices as a result, not just pushing up rents, but even excluding people who want to buy a property because they also buy up properties and push house prices up because they can afford to, these corporate landlords. So interesting, what then became the discussion was, well, do you think we should have a policy demand of ending landlordism? We said, yeah, actually it is. And Andrew Fisher, of course, extremely well read, then said, actually, well, that's what Keir Hardie stood on. He stood on a platform of socialism and ending landlordism. So again, I just think that's one example, and there's so many others where the demands that we had in the last two manifestos, in this climate now, demand a more radical solution. And actually, there's a natural, almost like steam from a kettle, evolution of these policies to a much more radical agenda. And I think that's where we're going, and I think it's almost unstoppable as well. This issue about debt, I'll give you that other example on debt. We're now faced with a situation, we're on the edge of possibly the worst recession since we've seen since the 1930s. That's what others are predicting. I'm not sure, but I certainly think it's going to be deep, and I think it's going to be hard. And because of exactly as Amy said, Rishi Sunak's announcement the other day was, well, pathetic, really, in terms of the millions of people that won't be supported. And as a result of that, will lose their jobs. It's happening in my constituency. I've got people on this street working for British Airways now who lose their jobs. And the union have done everything it possibly can, but we're up against a ruthless employer where the cards are mostly in their hands, and they're laying people off or they're cutting their wages. Now, that's what's happening right the way across the country. And Sunak's attempt at providing some elements of support was so pathetic. It certainly will lose many without any forms of support at all. And many of them as I say, in debt, severely in debt. So David Graeber, our friend who recently died, in his book on debt, he came up with, he said, I don't make policy solutions, I'll just offer one. And that's having a debt jubilee for everybody, for people, particularly in this pandemic. Let's just write off their debts. Not just do it in this country, as in the year 2000, let's have a debt jubilee for the global south, or follow that up with financial reform as well of the institutions that have loaded the developing world with debt in that way. So I think in every policy area now, it's leading to the solutions of 2017-19 manifestos with the foundations, but now the demands are so great and the threats are so great, we need something much more radical. And I think that's where we're leading. That's why, let's just come on to our role in all this then. That's why it's important that the Labour Party keeps pace with the changes that are coming and the challenges that we face. And that's why I think it's up to us as members of the Labour Party and the trade union movement is to make sure that those on the Labour leadership now keeps pace with those changes too. Keir laid out, as others have said, his 10-point manifesto to secure his election as Labour leader, and it completely echoed Jeremy Corbyn's platform and the platform that we all supported. Since then, as Andrew said, there's been a couple of policy announcements and lots of mutterings on the sidelines by others that people have become incredibly anxious about. But our job is to ensure that actually our policies aren't determined by one leader or one group of front bench representatives. Our policies are determined by our movement overall. And the reality is, if we want to get into government next time, we can't leave off policy discussions for 3 or 4 years until just before the general election. In some ways, there's a bit of a self-criticism because some of the ideas that we produced in 2019, we didn't lay the ground firmly enough. And that's a good example of broadband, because you need to give yourself time to explain what the need is, to explain what the policy is, and then discuss how it's rolled out at the national, local and regional levels, because people fully understand. So what we should be saying within the party now, there's no point in saying, look, the election's 3 or 4 years off, as I've heard some people say, therefore we don't need to pronounce on anything now. Quite the reverse. The crises that we're in, both in terms of the pandemic and the economic recession, people are saying, what are your solutions? So this is exactly the time for us to be sitting down saying, let's look at 2017-19 manifestos, look at the more radical solutions that we now need, and let's start just talking those through, developing them, but more importantly, rooting them in everyday people's lives, in the communities, so that when we're out there talking in whatever form we're talking to individuals or family or work colleagues or local community groups or whatever, we can explain to them what our thinking is at the moment about what the solutions there are, and engaging them in the development of those ideas and in the development of those policies that will then construct the next manifesto. And I don't think you can leave that too late. I think you have to start now, immediately. So talk through, yeah, this is what we said in 2019. We think that was the solution, but actually things have moved on. We need to be more radical. Here's what we're thinking about now. What do you think? And then in that way, you build that support. And so we build our program and push it forward as a movement, not relying upon something to be handed down from above, and not relying on this to come solely from a small group of thinkers or anything like that. This has got to be, I think, the best forms of policy discussion always reflects the wisdom of crowds, how we come together as a movement. With regard to Keir, I think, he laid out those 10 points. I think Keir's, and I'm not saying this in any disparaging way, quite the reverse, very supportively, Keir's main ambition is to get Labour into government. So we all agree, absolutely, completely, and absolutely agree. And that's what we're all working towards. But I don't think we'll go into government unless we've convinced people that we do have the policies that will address the real challenges that people face. And those challenges have been made much more difficult as a result of the last 6 to 8 months as a result of the pandemic and then the recession we face. And I think in that way, I think we can radicalize some of the ideas that maybe others at the moment are thinking we're too radical to get us to government. I think quite the reverse. But I do think it's the point others have made as well, that Amy made it. I do think actually the policy making has to be real grassroots policy making. It has to be, and they use the expression organic. I agree. It's got to be really reflective of people's lives at every level, but particularly at that level of the locality. I think the Labour Party is the party of community, bringing people together in their local communities to tackle the problems that people face and offer that viable alternative at the local level and inspire people that way. And in that way, you build levels of support that will then take us into government nationally. That will simply, as Jeremy said, the idea of us taking power nationally was to give power away to local communities, and so that they could develop their own futures. And I think that's what we're about on every level. So the issue for me is the movement has to show leadership now, and it's not relying on an individual leader or a group of shadow cabinet or whatever. It's up to us now to build that fervent of discussion and ideas. Finally, I just say this as well, that our ideas never get proven to be successful, or they never get accepted unless they're linked to a real struggle and real campaigning. And what has been absolutely inspiring at the moment is, despite all the difficult circumstances of campaigning whilst the pandemic is there and the lockdown, etc., is the scale of campaigning that's going on, the movements that are going on. We talked about the renters and Acorn campaigning on evictions. You look at what Unite did in terms of the British Airways, exposing them on the BA betrayal campaign and forcing the company to negotiating table. Look at the PCS picketing outside Tate at the moment. Look at Unison having the SOAS victory celebrations last week about insourcing. Again, all of those campaigns are going on with success, absolute success, because we're demonstrating again the scale of solidarity that we have within our movement. And I think all of us now have a responsibility on our shoulders to engage in, when someone plants that flag, that we rally to it and engage in that campaigning activity. But we do it alongside those discussions about the solutions. So again, I just give the example of social care that Andrew and Amy raised as well. The social care crisis in our homes was as a result of years and years of privatisation and cutbacks, but also grotesque levels of incompetence by this government, which made so many people vulnerable. But it made people vulnerable, both the residents of the care homes, but also the staff that were delivering the services. And the way in which those staff have been treated over years has been a disgrace. And I think we're in a situation now where it's a classic example for a campaign, as Andrew said, which is for decent wages, sectoral pay bargaining, the respect that the profession has, but is also linked to an economic issue as well. And the Women's Budget Group later this week are producing their report about what investment in social care could do in terms of professionalise the service, but also in raising wage levels and therefore having a significant boost to employment and demand within the economy overall. And I just think it's another classic example of a desperate need, but there's a radical solution to tackle that desperate need. But those workers within the care homes are possibly the most vulnerable and also exploited in a way which prevents them campaigning because we're so dependent upon them. So others have to do the campaigning alongside them and be forceful about it. And I think that's the way forward. In that way, we will, as a movement, lead the change that we desire and that we demand and is so desperately needed. I'm incredibly optimistic at the moment. I know it's been rough over the last 10 months, but I'm optimistic because there's been such a spirit of solidarity in the air right the way across communities and across our movement. And I just think we've laid foundations under Jeremy over the last 5 years, and those foundations are there to be built upon, and we can do it. Thanks, Jenny.
Thanks, John. Yeah, it is really positive actually thinking about the amount of movements that have been happening. And I think one thing that hasn't been mentioned has been Black Lives Matter, which in some ways has drawn all the different aspects of the things we've talked about, particularly around economic and social inequality, drawn all those threads together. And I don't think we should forget how inspiring it is to see a whole generation and a whole section of society that probably hasn't been massively involved in campaigning or not very visible campaigning up until this point, to be so publicly out there. I think that's been really important for us as a movement, as a Labour movement as well. I was going to kind of come on to some questions now. We've got quite a few people who posted up in the chat, and there's a number of different themes that people wanted to go to. I was going to start with a simple question, and maybe John, you could start with this first. What can we do to push through these left policy ideas in local councils? That was asked by Tom King.
What's interesting is that there's now a real, I think there's a real sort of new initiative, a new momentum, pardon the pun, building up at the local level in terms of local council Labour groups. We've now got the Socialist Campaign group of councillors that have come together, and it's building in size, but also it's building in activity in terms of the development of ideas and campaigning. And what we need to be pushing for now is national campaigning on behalf of Labour local councils, bringing them together. And if you look at what's happening on the ground in many areas, take what Jamie Driscoll's doing up in the northeast and Stevie Rother in Liverpool, And to be honest, Andy Burnham, the role that he's played around the COVID crisis, I think has been incredibly helpful. So there's sort of life coming back into local government now, Labour local government now, maybe that we haven't seen for quite a while. And I think that's the pressure of circumstance. They're having to, well, they've been shouldered with immense responsibilities as a result of the COVID crisis, inadequate resources. And I think even the sort of Labour councillors who up until now maybe not said boo to a goose when it comes to these problems now are pretty angry and are willing to start mobilising their communities again. So there's a potential there that we may not have had for a while. But we need to build upon it. And again, in local government now, I do think we need to start looking at a more radical programme of demands for the future. Much more powers, much more ability to raise local resources, much more ability, therefore, to do things that maybe they've been prevented in the past. And in some instances, you know, this is about the concept of decommodifying elements of our life. So everything that the Tories want to do is make sure everything is a commodity. What we've got to do is fight against that. So the more that we basically decommodify, the more that we say, here's some services that shouldn't be provided on the basis of whether you can pay for them, but should be provided on the basis of need, universal basic services, the more I think we can achieve the socialism that we want. So therefore, local authorities, I think local Labour groups now should be sitting down thinking, what sort of universal basic services should we be providing within our local authority? So you extend the remit of our local role and be quite challenging about that as well, and taking the private sector on, not just to bring back those things that have been privatised, but some of those aspects of life that actually people think only the private sector can deliver. But if we start delivering them, we deliver them then. And once you start delivering them through the state, then the next demand on is it's provided for free. We've got this wonderful ambition, and in the group Andrew and I have been discussing about, you know, just having public transport, for example, not just under public ownership at the local level again, but eventually we should be aiming for free public transport altogether. Let's start building up that sort of demand within our communities, provided at the local level by local authorities.
Thank you. I share a lot of those aspirations. And we're going to come to Amy on that question next, because I think you talked a little bit about local authorities. So what more do you think we could be doing to kind of build for these policies locally?
Obviously, they need a huge amount more money. Right now, we have, the Tories have such an enormous majority in Parliament. We need to focus on the places that we are in power. And I was really interested to hear what John was saying about how Labour groups need to start being a lot more ambitious in terms of what they offer to provide. Because I think in terms of the connections, and so, you know, there has definitely been a breakdown between Labour's core vote and the Labour Party itself, and there, you know, people not seeing the Labour Party, well, they're the ones who make sure I've got a decent job and I'm safe from work. They're the ones who make sure I've got childcare, etc., etc. That connection is no longer there with a lot of people, and we have to make sure we rebuild that connection, and also that kind of that automatic thought, well, they're the ones who look after me, which has definitely kind of disappeared. I was thinking, you know, there's a lot of people who are trade union members who aren't members because for political reasons. They're members because, well, of course I'd be in the union because they keep me safe at work, they protect my job and my income. That should be the same connection with Labour. Well, of course I'll vote for Labour because they're the ones who are going to make my life better. And I think the only way we can show it now is the places where we have power. And I'm pleased to hear that the Socialist Campaign Group is organising amongst councillors as well. Unite has been quite busy sort of rebuilding our Unite Councillors Network to provide another sort of left organising group within local government to think about what kind of initiatives we can like take forward within local government. We're also we're going to be running a scheme through our the sort of autumn and winter, to encourage people who are key workers to stand for council, because a lot of our focus has always been on getting left-wing candidates into Parliament, which is obviously very important and remains very important. And we had huge successes with that, as the sort of 2017 and 2019 intake has shown. But it's really important that we actually also have a big focus on local government, which we haven't really focused on, and I don't think we should make apologies for that, because the left's getting, as we were discussing, bigger and more organised and across these things. But yeah, so we need to think about making it easier for people to stand for council, encouraging people, socialists from across the movement, to stand, because it is obviously such an important role. And I think now that we're out of power again, people are starting to look at it a lot more. And to be fair, good on people like Andy Burnham, who are now, like, I don't know if he's had, some kind of personality transplant, but he has been amazing since the COVID crisis hit. I found myself busily retweeting him, and he shows how actually influential and powerful those positions can be. So yeah, that's what I would think about.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it is really important for people to think about standing for council. It's an important role, but it's tough times, so I think people kind of have to be realistic when they do it as well. Before I come to any of the speakers, actually, we've got so many of the questions posted in here. I think sort of this one's related a bit, and then I'll come to you, Andrew. Mick McAteer is saying about gilt rates being at near 0% and the state much more cost effective and equitable way than private finance to fund social housing, green transformation, social care, but the Tories still claim we can't afford it. So how do you communicate that to the public? And I guess part of that fits into local councils as well, because there is the potential, I think, for them to do more, although obviously the ability to borrow is somewhat limited.
Okay, so I mean, this is the sort of perennial question, I guess, isn't it? Is why not borrow? And I think the thing is, in the years from 2010 to 2015, the Tories won this argument because Labour didn't fight it, frankly. And they ran through austerity, saying, look, the deficit's big, the debt's growing, we just can't afford it. And actually, debt isn't necessarily a bad thing. Although this is probably a bit London-centric, this call, I suspect, like most things on the Labour left and most things in the Labour Party, actually, 60% of the population at some point will have got a mortgage and put themselves in massive debt over a very long period. And why does the majority of the population do that, and why do many more people aspire to do it even if they can't afford it? It's because at the end of the day, it is cheaper than renting for your entire life. Most people see it in that way, and you get an asset at the end of it. You get a return on that investment rather than just paying rent and having nothing to show for it at the end. So in a sense, that's the sort of argument we've got to make for borrowing. And the alternative to government borrowing is that the investment doesn't happen because the private sector won't do it, or you get less because the interest rate is higher, or you get people into debt themselves, because if the government doesn't borrow exactly as it did, or get the Bank of England to print money effectively for the furlough scheme, which, as I think Amy was saying, at its height was paying the wages of 9 million people, then those people would have been getting into massive debt. Probably loan sharks and payday loan companies charging much, much higher rates of interest. And that's the point. It's the government can borrow cheaply. It's the most efficient way of doing it. This is not ideological. This is just purely pragmatic. If you want things done, the most cost-effective way to do it is the government borrowing. And we saw the mess, frankly, that New Labour got into when it aped and extended the PFI scheme of John Major and Ken Clarke, because now we see the massive debts that's loaded on our hospitals, our prisons, our schools, because they didn't have the guts to just go, you know what, we're going to borrow it. The debt's going to go up, but you will have a return on it, and you will see your new school, your new hospital, and it won't be the money funneled into some company that's now based in the Bahamas because that PFI company is avoiding its taxes and charging a much higher interest rate. So I think we have to make this argument. It's important to do it. I think we also have to make the argument for tax rises. I profoundly disagree with the Labour front bench at the moment when they say now is not the time for tax rises, or tax rises suck demand out of the economy. yes, if you tax people at the basic income rate tax, so the sort of wages most people on this call will be earning, the 20% rate, or even at the 40% rate, you could argue. No, we shouldn't. No, we shouldn't put up VAT. No, we shouldn't put up council tax. I agree. All of those would suck demand out of the economy by taking money out of people's pockets. If you're talking about taxing the top 5%, if you're talking about taxing capital gains tax, i.e. the tax people pay on shares, on selling and trading in property, that is not taking any demand out of the economy. It's taking money off some very rich people up there to redistribute elsewhere. And those are the arguments we should be making. So we have to be literate on these things. And unfortunately, it feels to me like the Labour front isn't yet confident enough to start making those arguments. At the moment, the government, to be fair, has massively engaged in state intervention in getting the Bank of England to be basically its cash point. At the moment, it is clearly borrowing. So in a sense, some of that is happening just because the crisis is so bad, the government had to act to do those things with all the schemes it's done. But we have to extend that beyond, because what we can't have is a second round of austerity to pay for this crisis.
Thank you. I need to give us a very comprehensive answer on that. And I do think, I think that the left has been traditionally economically illiterate, and we shouldn't be. We should be really kind of quite clear that it's doable, it's achievable, and it's not a magic money tree that we have to shake. Nadia, I'm going to come to you on this, and I think there's a couple of people who've asked this sort of general point about shouldn't the thing we be pushing on right now is for the 2019 manifesto and Labour Party conference policy from last year to be sort of pushed forward. And I guess you're standing to be on the NEC. How would you help to make that happen? I think you're still on mute.
I'm just going to say, well, I think, to be fair, we've already started to see Annalise Dodd and Ed Miliband in the summer asked about how they could look at the green revolution again, industrial revolution. And there was some consultation that was undertaken, and there's some fantastic responses that were received around developing the policies from the existing manifesto. And I think we should be doing more of that. We should be doing that across all of the policies that we had in the manifesto. And I know, obviously, some of them may not be relevant, but I think there are quite a lot that aren't. For me, the Socialist Green New Deal is crucial, and there's a lot in there about how we can look at the crisis now from a green public transport, a national food service, healthy neighbourhoods, land use, 1 million good green jobs, all of the things that have really come to light that are desperately needed, that we always knew were needed, but are even more needed now more than ever. And I think we can't wait for 2024. I think we've heard a lot about we're going to wait and see how things lie, and before we make any new policies. We've got to do that now. We can't. We're in a crisis, and this crisis is going to get worse. We're going to have the worst recession we've ever seen in most of our lifetimes. We can't wait for those things to happen. We can't keep backing the current government on their assuming that they will look after people and the planet. That's not going to happen. We need to be agitating inside our party and outside of our party to get these things moving. And for me, the Green Industrial Revolution with the Socialist Green New Deal has always been really popular. I've been involved in agitating outside of the party, which I think is really important. I've been involved in the Don't Leave Organised campaign around statutory sick pay. And, we've made moves there around the trade union movement. We've got things into the TU Congress. We're doing branch motions and CLP motions, and there'll be EDMs. There's lots of ways we can agitate around things that we want as activists, and obviously that's the things that we'll be running campaigns on as NEC members around the things that matter to members. We've done some listen up events, and it's about what people in the party want to see. But I think the leadership has got to recognise that these things can't sit by, and we can't idly wait for the government to do something. They're not going to do anything. I mean, if you think of Sunak's summer statement, he's committed to £9 billion. I mean, when you think that in January we're going to be looking at a 10% to 14% unemployment, none of that is going to be enough. I mean, just looking at Germany, their green infrastructure spending is 36 billion, so we're nowhere close to the investment that's going to be needed. So we've got to fight for it, and we've got to make sure our leadership's fighting for it. And that's, Grassroots is we're part of a Grassroots Voice, and that's what we're committed to, is looking at the things that are popular and the things that we can push forward and develop on, and that's what we're committed to doing.
Thank you very much. And I think you're absolutely right. I think we've got to just be engaging with people as much as we possibly can on this. But obviously having voices like yours on the NEC would really help. So obviously we're urging people to vote for the Grassroots Voice slate. I think we're going to leave it there. We've had lots of questions, and I know that some of our speakers have to go and keep other commitments as well. What I will say before people leave is that labourhub.org.uk, we attempt to not just give you an opportunity to read other people's opinions, but also to contribute as well. And we want to hear from you. So if you've got any ideas for articles you might want to write, that's to all the panelists, that's to everybody listening as well. We want to hear from you, because it's about making sure that we're hearing a wide group of voices on the left within the Labour Party, and hopefully taking forward some of these things together. Thank you very much to our contributors this evening. It's been really interesting hearing from you. It's nice to see old faces and new faces. And hopefully see you all soon. Thank you very much to everybody who's tuned in, and keep on reading Labour Hub. Bye.